In the late 19th century, Russia was a land of vast contradictions. It was the largest country in the world, stretching from the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the deserts of Central Asia, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Yet behind its immense geography lay a society that, in many ways, still resembled the Middle Ages. Millions of peasants remained bound to the land, illiterate and desperately poor, while a small elite of nobles, priests, and czarist officii. Into this world, in 1870, was born a child who would one day set this enormous empire on fire. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Histoleni. Lenin's story is one of dramatic transformations. He was not born into poverty, nor was he destined from the cradle to lead revolutions. Instead, his journey was shaped by personal tragedy, intellectual brilliance, and an iron will that refused to bend to authority. From his comfortable childhood in a provincial town to his years of exile in Siberia, from his intense study of Karl Marx's writings to his leadership of the Bolshevik faction, and finally to the storming of the Winter Palace in Petrograd, his life tracks. This is not merely the biography of one man. It is the story of how an empire collapsed and how a new, unprecedented political experiment rose from its ashes. Stay with us until the end, because we will not only walk through Lenin's turbulent life, but also confront a question that continues to haunt historians today. If Lenin had lived longer, would the Soviet Union have been a gentler, more humane state? Or was Stalin's terror already written into the system that Lenin created? Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born on April 22, 1870, in the provincial town of Simbirsk, located along the Volga River. The town was far from the political and cultural center of Moscow, yet it was a place where provincial nobility, merchants, and officials mingled with peasants and artisans. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, had risen from humble beginnings. Born into a family of serfs in 1831, Ilya worked his way out of bondage and, through sheer determination, entered Kazan University to study physics and mathematics. From there, he built a career as an educator, eventually becoming an inspector of schools. His dedication to public education won him recognition by the state, and in the early 1880s, he was granted the rank of state councillor. This status effectively elevated the Ulyanov family into the hereditary nobility of the Russian Empire. Though they remained minor nobles, closer in lifestyle to the educated middle class than to the lavish aristocracy. Lenin's mother, Maria Alexandrovna Blank, came from a cultured family. She was the daughter of a physician and had German, Swedish, and Jewish ancestry, though her Jewish background was little known, and perhaps concealed in an empire rife with anti-Semitism. Maria was intelligent, devoted to her children's education, and quietly resilient. She bore 8 children, though 2 died in infancy. Vladimir was the third surviving child, younger than his sister Anna and his brother Alexander. The Ulyanov household was filled with books, music, and intellectual discussion. The children were taught languages, literature, and science from an early age. They were also encouraged to play chess, a game at which Vladimir excelled. His childhood was materially comfortable. The family owned a house in Simbirsk and a countryside estate at Kokushkino, where they spent summers amidst gardens and forests. It was an upbringing that combined privilege with discipline, laying the foundation for Lenin's sharp intellect. comfort and stability did not last. In January 1886, when Vladimir was just 15, his father suffered a fatal brain hemorrhage. The sudden death shocked the family, depriving them of their patriarch and leaving young Vladimir deeply shaken. If that loss was devastating, what came next was catastrophic. In March 1887, Vladimir's older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, a promising student at St. Petersburg University, was arrested. He had joined a radical group plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The attempt failed, and Alexander, along with several conspirators, was executed by hanging. The death of his brother seared itself into Vladimir's mind. Alexander had been seen as the pride of the family, a brilliant young man with a bright future. His execution turned him into a martyr for the revolutionary cause. For Vladimir, the message was clear. Reform was impossible. Under the autocracy, and only uncompromising struggle could topple the Tsarist system. After Alexander's execution, Vladimir became more withdrawn, serious, and intellectually fierce. He began reading revolutionary literature with obsessive focus. Friends and teachers noticed the change. The once lively young man had transformed into a figure of icy determination. To understand why Vladimir turned radical, we must understand the Russia in which he grew up. For centuries, the Russian Empire had remained on the fringes of European modernity, while nations like Britain, France, and the United States surged ahead in industrialization, political reform, and urban culture. Russia remained dominated by autocracy, the Orthodox Church, and a largely rural economy. The one major reform of the 19th century was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, initiated by Tsar Alexander II. Millions of peasants were freed from legal bondage, yet their lives hardly improved. They were forced to make redemption payments for land, which often turned out to be insufficient and of poor quality. Discontent simmered. Alexander II introduced reforms in law, education, and administration. But in 1881, he was assassinated by radicals from the group known as the People's Will. His son and successor, Alexander III, swung the pendulum sharply in the opposite direction. He clamped down on dissent, enforced Russification policies on minority groups, and gave the secret police, the Okhrana, broad powers to crush opposition. In this atmosphere, new ideologies spread. Intellectuals discussed nihilism, anarchism, and Marxism. Radical groups, often made up of students and young nobles, sought to challenge the empire. Some resorted to terrorism, others to clandestine education of peasants and workers. It was a time when old traditions and new ideas collided, making Russia a powder keg ready to explode. Vladimir Ulyanov, the young man from Simbirsk, was shaped by this environment. His brother's martyrdom had shown him the cost of resistance. Now, the writings of thinkers like Karl Marx offered him a blueprint for revolutionary change. In 1887, Vladimir enrolled at Kazan University. Within months, he joined protests against government restrictions on student societies. The authorities cracked down harshly. Vladimir was arrested and expelled from the university. Though only 19, he was already branded as a political troublemaker. Yet this setback only hardened his resolve. He immersed himself in the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, memorizing passages and debating their ideas with fellow radicals. He became convinced that Marx's analysis of capitalism and class struggle held the key to Russia's future. In 1890, thanks to his mother's persistence and connections, Vladimir was allowed to sit for exams at St. Petersburg University as an external student. He passed with flying colors, receiving top honors in law. For a time, he worked as a legal assistant in Samara, representing peasants and townsfolk. But his real passion lay elsewhere. Even while practicing law, he devoted himself to organizing workers, writing articles, and building contacts in underground circles. By the mid-1890s, Vladimir Ulyanov, soon to be known as Lenin, was deeply involved in underground circles in St. Petersburg, the empire's capital. He connected with groups of radical intellectuals and workers inspired by Marxism. Together, they formed a network that distributed pamphlets and organized clandestine meetings. In 1895, Lenin helped establish the Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. This group sought not just to agitate among workers, but to combine practical strikes with revolutionary theory. Their aim was to elevate the consciousness of the working class, preparing them for eventual revolution. But the Tsarist secret police were watching. Late that year, Lenin was arrested just as he and his comrades were preparing to launch an underground newspaper called The Workers' Cause. He was imprisoned for over a year, denied legal representation, and eventually sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. Siberia was harsh, but not a prison in the traditional sense. Lenin settled in the village of Shushenskoye, where he lived under surveillance, but with relative freedom. He used this time to read, reflect, and write. It was here that he began drafting what would become one of his first major works, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, published in 1899 under the pseudonym Vladimir Lenin. In it, he argued that capitalism was already taking root in Russia, and that Marxist revolution was not only possible, but inevitable. During exile, Lenin was joined by Nadezhda Krupskaya, a dedicated Marxist school teacher who became his lifelong partner. They married in Siberia, though due to health complications, they would never have children. Instead, their partnership was one of political devotion, united in the cause of revolution. When Lenin's exile ended in 1900, he could not safely remain in St. Petersburg. Instead, he traveled abroad, beginning a long period of European exile that would define the next 2 decades of his life. His first stop was Switzerland, then Munich, where he launched the revolutionary newspaper Iskra, the Spark. Smuggled back into Russia, Iskra became a lifeline for Marxist activists, spreading ideas and uniting scattered groups. Lenin believed that propaganda and disciplined organization were the keys to building a revolutionary movement. In 1902, while based in London, Lenin published one of his most famous works, What is to be Done? In this fiery pamphlet, he rejected the idea that socialism would naturally emerge from workers' struggles. Instead, he insisted that a tightly organized vanguard party of professional revolutionaries must lead the way. Without such leadership, he argued, the workers' movement would remain trapped in trade union consciousness, fighting only for better wages rather than systemic change. This bold idea became the cornerstone of what would later be known as Leninism. It was a departure from more orthodox Marxism, which assumed that revolution would grow spontaneously out of economic conditions. Lenin instead believed in intervention. The revolution had to be led, guided, and, if necessary, forced. By 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, had grown large enough to hold a second Congress, which convened partly in Brussels and then in a chapel in London. Here, the seeds of division that Lenin had sown came to full bloom. The central debate was over party membership. Julius Martov, another leading Marxist, argued for a broad definition. Anyone sympathetic to the cause could be a member. Lenin countered that only those willing to dedicate themselves fully to the struggle should be admitted. For Lenin, discipline and commitment mattered more than numbers. When the vote came, Lenin's faction narrowly won. His group was nicknamed the Bolsheviks, meaning the majority, though ironically, they were often smaller in number. Martov's group became known as the Mensheviks, the minority. Though both remained part of the same party at first, the division quickly deepened. Lenin launched polemics against the Mensheviks, accusing them of weakness and betrayal. In 1904, he published One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, a scathing attack that widened the gulf. By 1912, the split was final. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks would henceforth operate as separate political parties. This division would have enormous consequences. While the Mensheviks believed in gradual reform and coalition politics, Lenin's Bolsheviks were committed to revolution at any cost. The year 1905 marked the first great revolutionary upheaval of the 20th century in Russia. On January 22nd, a peaceful procession of workers marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition for better conditions. They carried religious icons and sang hymns, believing the Tsar to be a benevolent father who would hear their pleas. Instead, the Imperial Guard opened fire. Over 150 people were killed, hundreds wounded. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, and it shattered the myth of the Tsar as a protector of his people. Across the empire, strikes and uprisings erupted. Workers formed Soviets, councils that organized strikes and managed protests. In the countryside, peasants attacked landlords' estates. Even parts of the army mutinied. For a moment, it seemed that the Tsarist regime might collapse. Lenin returned secretly to Russia to take part. He encouraged the formation of new newspapers, such as Novaya Zhizn, New Life, and sought to expand the Bolsheviks' influence. Yet the revolution lacked coordination. By October, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising civil rights and a new parliament, the Duma. The manifesto temporarily calmed the masses. But the promises were soon broken. The first Duma, elected in 1906, was dissolved when it proved too radical. Subsequent Dumas were conservative and toothless. Repression followed: martial law, executions, and exile for revolutionaries. By 1907, the revolutionary tide had ebbed. For Lenin, the lesson was clear. Partial reforms could not bring change. Only total revolution could topple Tsarism. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 plunged Russia into chaos. Millions of soldiers were conscripted, poorly trained, and badly supplied. The Eastern Front became a slaughterhouse, while at home, food shortages and inflation crippled daily life. By February 1917, discontent boiled over. Strikes erupted in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg. Women textile workers marched for bread. Soldiers mutinied rather than fire on the crowds. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government was formed, made up of liberals and moderate socialists, but it inherited an impossible situation: war exhaustion, economic collapse, and growing demands for land reform. Lenin, still in exile in Switzerland, recognized the moment. With German assistance, hoping to destabilize their Russian enemy, Lenin and a group of revolutionaries were transported across Europe in a sealed train, arriving in Petrograd in April. At the Finland station, Lenin delivered a fiery speech and issued his April theses. In them, he rejected cooperation with the provisional government, calling instead for all power to the Soviets. He demanded immediate withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land to peasants, and workers' control of factories. The summer of 1917 was turbulent. Protests and strikes grew, culminating in the July days, when mass demonstrations rocked Petrograd. The government cracked down, and Lenin fled to Finland in disguise. But events soon turned in his favor. In September, a failed coup attempt by General Lavur Kornilov forced the government to rely on the Bolsheviks for defense. Their popularity surged. By October, Lenin returned secretly to Petrograd. Together with Leon Trotsky, who now led the Petrograd Soviet, the Bolsheviks prepared for insurrection. On the night of October 25th, Julian calendar, Red Guards and armed workers stormed government buildings. The following day, they seized the Winter Palace, arresting members of the provisional government. The October Revolution had succeeded. Power now lay with the Soviets, and in practice, with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks seized power, but their control was fragile. Russia was still at war with Germany, and the front was collapsing. Lenin pushed for peace at any cost. In March 1918, the new government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers. The terms were brutal. Russia lost Finland, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and large parts of the Caucasus. It was a staggering territorial and population loss. Many Bolsheviks opposed it, but Lenin argued that survival of the revolution was more important than land. Almost immediately, Russia was plunged into civil war. The Bolshevik Red Army, organized by Trotsky, faced the White Armies, a loose alliance of monarchists, liberals, and moderate socialists. Foreign powers including Britain, France, Japan, and the United States sent troops and supplies to aid the whites. The conflict was savage. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Villages were burned. Executions and reprisals became routine. To enforce discipline and crush opposition, Lenin created the Cheka, the secret police, which unleashed the infamous Red Terror. Thousands of perceived enemies, nobles, priests, officers, and even rival socialists, were executed or sent to labor camps. Despite the odds, the Reds gradually gained the upper hand. By 1920, they had defeated most white forces, though pockets of resistance lingered until 1922. The new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was proclaimed in December 1922. The victory was secured at a terrible cost. Millions perished from fighting, famine, and disease. Russia emerged devastated, but under the firm grip of Lenin's party. The years of war and civil conflict left Russia in ruins. By 1921, famine stalked the land. Crops had failed, supply lines collapsed, and millions starved. Workers in the cities faced shortages of food and fuel. Even sailors, once Bolshevik supporters, revolted at Kronstadt. demanding reforms. Faced with disaster, Lenin made a dramatic and pragmatic shift. In March 1921, he announced the New Economic Policy, NEP. This policy represented a temporary retreat from full-scale socialism. Small businesses were allowed to reopen, peasants could sell their surplus grain on the market, and limited private trade was permitted. The state retained control of major industries, such as steel, railways, and banking, but daily life gained a measure of breathing room. The NEP revived the economy. Markets reappeared, and peasants had incentives to produce. For many ordinary Russians, it was a relief after years of deprivation. But within the party, some saw it as a betrayal of Marxist principles. Lenin countered that the NEP was a tactical retreat, a necessary step to rebuild before advancing again toward socialism. By 1922, Lenin's health was failing. Years of stress, assassination attempts, and perhaps underlying illness had taken their toll. In May, he suffered the first of several strokes, leaving him partially paralyzed. He never fully recovered. During this period, Lenin dictated what became known as his testament. In it, he assessed the leading figures of the Communist Party. He praised Trotsky's intellect, but warned of his arrogance. He was far more critical of Joseph Stalin, who had risen to the post of General Secretary. Lenin described Stalin as rude, overbearing, and dangerous, and even suggested he should be removed from his position. But Lenin would not live to enforce his warning. In December 1922, he suffered another stroke, losing much of his ability to speak. On January 21st, 1924, at the age of 53, Lenin died at his estate in Gorky, near Moscow. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum on Red Square, where it remains on display to this day. After his death, a fierce struggle for power erupted. Stalin outmaneuvered Trotsky and other rivals, consolidating absolute control by the end of the decade. Though Lenin had never been an outright dictator in the Stalinist sense, the system he built, a one-party state with a powerful secret police, laid the foundations for what came next. The life of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is one of history's most dramatic arcs. Born in 1870 to a comfortable, educated family in the provincial town of Simbirsk, he grew up in relative privilege. Yet tragedy, the death of his father, and especially the execution of his beloved brother Alexander, drove him toward radical politics. From those early years, Lenin's path became inseparable from Russia's stormy fate. He read Marx with fervor, studied law, and sharpened his intellect into a weapon. Exile in Siberia hardened him. Years spent wandering between Switzerland, Munich, Paris, and London transformed him into a theorist and strategist of revolution. His vision was uncompromising. Only a disciplined vanguard party could overthrow the czarist state and lead the working class to power. The failed revolution of 1905 taught him the limits of partial reform. The bloodshed of the First World War convinced him that the Russian Empire was rotting from within, and when the chance came, in 1917, he seized it without hesitation. The October Revolution toppled the provisional government and set in motion the creation of the world's first communist state. Under Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks survived foreign invasion, civil war, and famine. He sanctioned brutal measures, red terror, political repression, and the Cheka, but also made pragmatic retreats, like the new economic policy. To his supporters, he was the voice of uncompromising revolution. To his enemies, the destroyer of Russia's old order. When Lenin died in 1924, at just 53 years old, his body was embalmed, his image immortalized, and his name forever linked with revolution. But his death left a vacuum. Though he warned against Stalin's ambition, the system he had built, a centralized, one-party state with secret police and censorship, allowed Stalin to rise to absolute power. The Soviet Union that followed was at once Lenin's creation and something darker still. And so we return to the question, if Lenin had lived longer, would history have been different? Would he have steered the Soviet Union toward a more balanced, less repressive future? Or was Stalin's terror already embedded in the very foundations Lenin had laid? Historians continue to debate, and perhaps we will never know for certain. What we do know is this: Lenin remains one of the most influential and controversial figures of the 20th century. His ideas inspired revolutions across the globe, and his methods set patterns that would shape world politics for decades. So now, we turn to you. Was Lenin a visionary who sought to liberate the oppressed, or the architect of a system that led inevitably to dictatorship? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this journey through history compelling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the turning points that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep exploring history.